Hello, and welcome to another episode of KCMO Reacts. My name is Aaron, and um, I mentioned something about mythology and about how certain article was a piece of national mythology, and apparently this at least one person who saw it was like, what do you mean by mythology? This doesn't have the stuff in it that I consider mythology. And you're right. Mythology is about origins, right? It's about explaining what your values are, where your values come from, and and the mythology that we typically hear about is really old mythology. It's stories having to do with it, at least in my experience, stories having to do with like Thor and Odin and Zeus and Artemis and all this things like that, going Egyptian mythology, and Babylonian mythology, and but we're surrounded by mythology. Mythology just explains origins. Current mythology, when you have mythology today, it's not talking about the same stuff that old mythologies were rooted in. Those were active religions, and I mean, you could say that our religions today are themselves mythologies. And I probably just turned off a whole bunch of people. And believe me, when we in the Intro to Cultural Anthropology section that I took in my undergrad, we had about 8 people get up and leave the class because they weren't going to allow their faith to be placed on the same level as every other value system out there, every other, religion, cult, mystical practice, whatever you want to, they were not into comparative stuff at all. And so if that turns you off, I'm sorry, but that's the background that I'm coming from. And so when you talk about when you talk about, say, the Judaic, the modern Judaic mythology, for example, includes things like the not just the stuff from the Old Testament, but also at least what we consider to be the Old Testament, but more modern things having to do with Hanukkah and things like that. Things that are not found in the Christian tradition or in the Muslim tradition, even though they all came out of the same basis. They have their own mythologies, even though they are all supposedly rooted in the same Old Testament, the same, stuff that came before. As they split, they develop their own mythologies. Saul of Tarsus, falling from his donkey, for example, becoming blind, having the scales fall from his eyes. That is a part of Christian mythology, mostly because Paul, as he became known from that point on, went on to found a number of early Christian settlements who outlived the original Jerusalem church, which was destroyed in AD 66, along with a lot of the people who had personally known Jesus. The Muslim faith has their own mythology that again comes later than that and explains their origins. Muhammad's trek to Mecca. If the mountain won't come to Muhammad, then Muhammad must go to the mountain. And and they have their own stories, their own traditions that are also not just about just like Christianity has their own traditions that aren't rooted in Judaic traditions. Muslim traditions have traditions that are not rooted in Christian traditions because they evolve separately. Although they have the same root, they developed at different times in different places and have much different cultural cultural influences. And so they all have their own creation mythology, not necessarily related to the world, but to their faith. Similarly, the U.S. has a lot of national mythology. Probably one of the biggest examples is George Washington and the cherry tree. There were no cherry trees in North America at the time, right? Cherry trees were first appeared in North America when they were given as a gift by Japan to the U.S. when as a gesture of friendship after Washington D.C. was laid out, which happened after George Washington was dead. So there's no way that he could have chopped down the cherry tree. They still teach that in schools. At least I was taught it. It's and really you don't hear anything to contradict this unless you're A, on the internet, or B, you get into college level courses and they kind of talk about how these things are actually not literal history. It's a lesson, and it is a lesson about the virtuosity of George Washington, which he was a scumbag slaver, but on the other hand, he was literally offered the crown of the United States, and he's like, no, we need to not do kings anymore. We just got rid of the last one, and he declined to run for president for a third term because, hey, again, I don't want to be a king. We should have a regular rotation of leaders at the top. Isn't that what we all agreed to? And a lot of it was just that George Washington was pretty idealistic. He wasn't well educated by the standards of the people who surrounded him. Everybody thought that he was absolutely brilliant because he would just sit there and listen to everybody else, and then he would say something based on what everybody else had talked about, and this made him seem very wise when really it was that they were going on about things that lay outside of his education. And he could kind of point out things that were inherently contradictory in what people were saying when they themselves didn't recognize the contradictions because they were just basically they were discussing things that may or may not have had any relevance to what they're actually to the actual subject at hand. They were just trying to show off their knowledge to one another, which is kind of how a lot of people do. That's how a lot of people are, and I'm probably guilty of that as well. I mean, hell, here I am with the YouTube channel, so certainly I think I have something to say. The story of George Washington and the cherry tree, I believe, came out around in the 1830s. I want to say they had it was children. It was basically a primer on how to raise a good American kid. It had all these different stories about the life of George Washington, kind of parables about using George Washington as the as kind of the model boy. And so things like George Washington chopping down a cherry tree. That's actually a very good story. It's a useful story. It's like, you take responsibility for what you do, and you don't lie about having done something that you obviously did. And the story, so the story in itself is a good lesson. It was not a factual event, but it is a part of American mythology and what we want to see ourselves as. And we have a lot of national mythologies in our country, actually. And things like the way how the Alamo is presented is a part of American mythology. It's a part of Texan mythology, and it wasn't really all that important in the grand scheme of things. Fall of the Alamo didn't really mean anything. The fact that the Alamo was defended, you could argue, meant that we were their defense kept Santa Anna busy and allowed other Texans to form up into and there are ways that you could argue that it was indeed decisive, just not victorious or anything like that. And that is a piece of American mythology, of national mythology now. The sinking of the Maine, a piece of national mythology. In that one, that was I believe that modern investigation showed that it sank because it was coal fired, and there were fires that were actually in the coal, which was not an uncommon thing among coal-fired ships. The Titanic had a coal fire going on its maiden voyage, and that started before they took on passengers. It was still going when the ship sank. It was not uncommon for there to be coal fires. This one just got out of hand, big bada boom, and boom, where it was a good excuse for a war with Spain, and we got Cuba and a couple of other places out of it because of that. That was, but the story of the Maine continues to be told because it is a part of our mythology. The idea that the whole manifest destiny thing was a part of American mythology, of national mythology. If you identify as Southern, the myth of the lost cause is a piece of mythology that either you identify with or are very familiar with, which is basically and that's something to get into. That's a whole different can of worms I'm not going to open up here, because I promise to you is I'm going to try to keep this fairly short. But what I'm getting at is that when we talk about mythology, when we talk about national mythologies, we're talking about the origins of countries, of societies, of the stories that they tell about themselves. And from that, you can kind of see, generally speaking, why countries do what they do internationally. Because those myths change over time. They're not fixed in stone. They're largely oral traditions. Sometimes they're written down, but but they're repeated over and over again, and different parts of it are emphasized depending on the mood of the country or the society at the time. So, like, Manifest Destiny was something that I'm taught, but Manifest Destiny doesn't really, we're not trying to conquer the rest of North America currently, under the current administration. Okay, we're not currently actively trying to broaden our borders, and I think I addressed that in the previous episode about economic colonialism, as to why we shifted away from military conquest, but that's still there, right? That's still a part of the stories that we tell, because that explains why we did what we did with the Native Americans. Same kind of divine right bullcrap that pretty much every empire claims, and that is a part of our national mythology. It's not one that we stress, but it's one that kind of hangs over us, still shapes our view of ourselves as ultra special. And when you look at it in those terms, you see a lot of the rhetoric that from modern politics about American exceptionalism, about how much better we are just by being born as Americans in our country. That makes us better. That means that it doesn't matter how crappy your life actually is. You're still better than somebody else who might be living a better life somewhere else just because you're here. And it also means that national mythologies are a coping mechanism that give the leadership of the country an out when it comes to providing services and things like that. They still shape us, even if we say, oh, all this stuff is in the past. They still shape us today, and they shape every other country, and they shape every conflict that we see, and you can't really understand what will end a conflict unless you understand why they got into that conflict. Now, there's a lot of conflicts that happen that have nothing to do with national mythology, really. But when that's invoked very strongly, then you have to realize that the textbook reasons for why governments and countries get into wars may not apply in this situation. And maybe you need to listen when somebody like, say, Medvedev, granted he's a drunk, and granted he's not considered a reliable narrator for most things, but when he says when he said, I think in March or April of 2022, that the West needs to back off of helping Ukraine because Russia will expend all of its strength as a state in order to retake Ukraine to the point of dissolution, because eradicating the Ukrainian people is that important to them, and that Russia will never use a nuclear weapon in this fight. But he said, what the West doesn't understand is that there's a bunch of crazy people who are regional powers who will have access to those same nuclear weapons and who would be far more likely to use them. And good luck dealing with 13 or 16 of them in the future. That wasn't a word-by-word quote. I mean, he's speaking in Russian, for heaven's sakes. I may have tweeted that in English. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure he knows English as a... But obviously I'm paraphrasing. And when people say things like that, and you kind of have to take that thing seriously when you have a piece of when you have an article that's put out that's heralding victory in the war, and then it throws out that, oh yeah, the most important thing isn't really security, it's about reuniting the Russian people, and that Ukraine was once a part of Russia and will always be a part of Russia. And I'm going to get into that on a piece that Putin put out. I think it was in 2021. The text of it's available on Wikisource, so I'll be presenting that probably in slices because I don't want to devote 2.5 hours to reading it and then doing an analysis of it. So I'm going to break it up into probably 15-20 minute episodes where we go into his view on his view on history and what it means to be Russian, and versus what the rest of the world kind of looks at. So stick around. If you've been here this whole time watching this video, thank you very much. I appreciate it. If I have a link to a fundraiser down below for Ukraine, it's actually set up by another YouTuber that I follow. I'm not nearly big enough to have my own campaign, but I'm more than happy to have people support his fundraiser, and is to provide equipment going to the front lines. The 69th Sniffing Brigade, which is set up by NAFO, is along kind of that's what that's linked to. And I think it's they're not paying me. They don't even know I exist. So it's not a paid endorsement by any stretch. That's actually from another YouTuber that I'm kind of trying to feed stuff into, is Georgie from Ukraine Matters. He's in Denmark, has a Ukrainian wife, goes to Ukraine quite a bit, understands both Russian and Ukrainian, and does a lot of his own research. Great guy. And if you could do me a favor, one more favor. Every episode I tell you, take care of yourselves, take care of one another. If you've done something to help somebody else out that you didn't have to during last week, brag about it in the comments a little bit. Because that's important. It's important to help others, especially people who aren't connected to you. If you bought groceries for someone who was on food stamps and was having to put away diapers or something because they couldn't afford it, so you bought them the diapers or something. Whatever. Go ahead and drop that in the comments. Have a great day.